winter light above West Texas, the mountain looks almost untouched. Only when the camera moves in, along the limestone rim of the Sierra Diablo range above the scrub desert near Van Horn, does the cut appear. A narrow tunnel mouth, 2,500 feet above the valley floor, leading into the rock Jeff Bezos bought for a clock that is meant to outlive his name. Inside, in a shaft roughly 500 feet deep, a spiral staircase chipped directly into the stone wraps around a column of steel gears and a 10,000-pound counterweight, the first full-scale clock of the long now, funded with at least $42 million from Bezos Expeditions. In a 2018 post, he called it a symbol for long-term thinking, a machine designed to tick once a year and chime once a millennium. Dust hangs in the shaft. The rock is cool underhand. The stainless steel teeth catch the last sun that filters down the stairwell. It feels like a private cathedral to time, and an unfinished monument to one man's attempt to inscribe himself into the mountain. The clock has not yet rung once, but already the stone around it is older than every empire it is meant to outlast. In 1989, in an office in Los Angeles, computer scientist Daniel Hillis drafted an idea that sounded less like engineering and more like an architectural parable, a mechanical clock designed to keep time for 10,000 years. The concept emerged not from a watch company or observatory, but from a theoretical computer scientist who had spent years thinking about parallel processing and artificial intelligence at Thinking Machines Corporation. Hillis had watched technological cycles accelerate, each generation of computers obsolete within years, and began wondering what a device optimized for the opposite timescale might look like. His initial sketches, preserved in the Long Now Foundation archives, show not pocket watches or tower clocks, but something closer to architectural sections. Tall vertical chambers cut into mountains, mechanisms distributed across hundreds of feet of elevation, and tiny human figures drawn for scale at the bottom of deep shafts. By the late 1990s, working with writer and Whole Earth catalog founder Stuart Brand, Hillis helped establish the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco to house this idea and give it institutional form. The foundation's charter was dated April 1, 1996, a 5-digit year format meant to stretch the human sense of temporal scale and force readers to confront the arbitrariness of 3- or 4-digit thinking. Early organizational documents describe the foundation's mission as fostering slower, better thinking and taking responsibility for the next 10,000 years, a time frame that encompasses the entire span of recorded human civilization up to the present. This was not a preservation society focused on protecting the past, but an institution designed to colonize the future through symbolic infrastructure. The mechanical drawings produced in those first years show tall, sectional cuts of imagined towers and underground chambers. The lines are careful, almost ecclesiastical in their precision. Proportions are adjusted as if for a campanile or medieval bell tower that will never see the sky. These are not just clock diagrams, but elevation studies, spatial compositions that balance void and mechanism, lightness and mass. In one early rendering, a human figure stands at the base of a vertical shaft, perhaps 200 feet tall. The clock mechanism rises above like organ pipes in a cathedral, each component scaled to human legibility, but arranged to create an overwhelming vertical drama. Musician and producer Brian Eno, who later joined the Long Now board and took responsibility for composing the clock's chime sequences, gave the project its enduring name in a foundational essay. He called it the Clock of the Long Now, arguing that a visible monumental timepiece, one that demanded pilgrimage and patience to visit, could reframe civilization's sense of duration in an age of instant gratification and short-term profit cycles. Eno's essay, circulated in technology and design circles in the late 1990s, described the clock less as a functional instrument than as a piece of conceptual art scaled to geological ambition. I want to build a clock that ticks once a year. The century hand advances once every 100 years, and the cuckoo comes out on the millennium. The project's technical requirements, compiled by Hillis and engineer Alexander Rose in detailed design briefs, read like a strange architectural manifesto. The clock must survive for 10 millennia. It must be maintainable with tools and materials available in a Bronze Age civilization, assuming industrial supply chains collapse. It must avoid using tempting materials, gold, precious stones, easily salvageable metals that would invite theft or vandalism. It must be accurate enough to serve as a working timepiece, yet forgiving enough to allow for centuries of neglect between maintenance visits. And it must be housed in a structure capable of protecting it from weather, earthquakes, and human conflict for longer than any government or institution has yet endured. Every line on those first drawings served this philosophy. Thin spiral staircases are sketched along the margins of the sectional views, wrapping around the central void. Gear trains are drawn with exaggerated tooth profiles, emphasizing their mechanical legibility. Small annotations note materials: stainless steel, titanium, stone counterweight. Tiny human figures appear periodically as scale references, always dwarfed by the mechanism above them. In one particularly striking section, dated to 1997, the staircase spirals upward through 5 distinct chambers, each containing progressively slower gears. A daily pendulum at the bottom then displays that advance yearly, by decade, by century. And finally, a mechanism that moves only once per millennium, positioned at the very top where a narrow shaft admits a single beam of sunlight for synchronization. Here, in these early concept sheets produced in offices and studios in San Francisco and Los Angeles, the spiral staircase is still just ink, a marginal detail in a speculative architectural cross-section. Yet even at this conceptual stage, the geometry of ascent is fundamental to the design. The clock is conceived less as an instrument mounted on a wall or placed on a pedestal than as a building one walks through, a vertical procession through time itself. Visitors are imagined climbing slowly, pausing at landings to observe mechanisms, reading their pace by the diminishing frequency of visible motion until, at the top, they encounter a gear that will not complete a full rotation in their lifetime. The design team understood that the clock's cultural power would depend on this architectural choreography. A 10,000-year clock displayed in a museum case where visitors could walk past in seconds would communicate precision but not duration. A clock hidden entirely, with no provision for human witness, would be a philosophical gesture, but not a symbol. The spiral staircase solved this problem. It transformed timekeeping into pilgrimage, abstraction into physical experience, and mechanism into monument. The visitor would not simply read the time but earn it through ascent, arriving breathless at displays whose slowness would feel profound rather than broken. It was meant to last forever, but at this stage, it existed only on paper and in conversation. The drawings circulated among technology executives, futurists, and design theorists in Silicon Valley and beyond, attracting interest, but not yet the capital required to turn limestone and steel into a working monument. The Long Now Foundation operated out of modest offices, funding its early activities through memberships, lecture series, and small donations. Hillis continued his work at Thinking Machines and later at Disney Imagineering. Brand wrote articles and gave talks. Anno composed experimental music. The clock remained an idea, extraordinarily detailed but fundamentally speculative. The question facing the foundation as the millennium approached was not whether the design could work, the mathematics and mechanics were sound, but where on earth such a structure could be built and whether anyone would pay to cut it into real rock. It needed to be remote enough to discourage vandalism, stable enough geologically to survive millennia, and owned by someone willing to permit a very long lease. It needed to be neither so hidden that no one would ever visit, nor so accessible that it would become a tourist site stripped of contemplative power. And it needed a patron who understood that the return on this investment would not be measured in their lifetime or their children's or in any accountable human span. In those early design documents, beneath the technical specifications and philosophical statements, one finds a recurring architectural problem: how to build something permanent in a world where nothing lasts. The spiral staircase, even in these preliminary sketches, already carries the weight of that contradiction. It is drawn as a path into the future, but the paper it is drawn on is already yellowing in the archive. By the time the first working prototype completed its program tick from the year 19999 to 2000 inside a laboratory housing at Fort Mason in San Francisco on 31st December 1999, Daniel Hillis and the Long Now Foundation had proven that the core mechanism could be fabricated and assembled. The prototype stood roughly 8 feet tall, an elegant demonstration model machined from stainless steel and brass, its gears exposed behind clear acrylic panels so visitors could watch the mechanical logic unfold. Timing was provided by a small pendulum and a thermal compensation system, and the display showed not hours and minutes, but the 5-digit year, a day-of-the-year counter, and representations of astronomical cycles. When midnight arrived, the mechanism advanced smoothly, its precision validated. A larger, more refined version of this prototype would later be installed at the Science Museum in London, where it remains on permanent display. But what interested the Long Now team next was not another object for a gallery or museum floor. It was a place, a site that could behave like the foundations of a cathedral, offering both protection and pilgrimage. Around 2005, after years of site surveys and negotiations, the foundation acquired land near the summit of Mount Washington, a limestone peak rising to roughly 10,000 feet in the Snake Range near Ely, Nevada. The mountain's elevation placed it above the tree line in a zone of extreme temperature variation and minimal human traffic. Geological surveys confirmed stable bedrock and negligible seismic activity. The white limestone cliffs on the mountain's upper slopes would allow tunneling into solid stone with relative predictability, and the remoteness ensured that any visitor would have to commit significant time and effort to reach the site. Architectural drawings and environmental assessment reports from this Nevada site speak the language of landscape architecture more than horology. They include topographic maps with hand-drawn contour lines, sections through the mountain showing the proposed shaft descending from near the summit, and plans detailing access roads, staging areas, and minimal surface infrastructure. Engineers calculated freeze-thaw cycles at that elevation, modeled wind loads on exposed metal components, and planned for seasonal snow accumulation that could seal the entrance for months at a time. The clock itself would be entirely subterranean, insulated by hundreds of feet of limestone from surface temperature swings, and protected from precipitation, wind, and ultraviolet degradation. The design for the Nevada installation envisioned a series of chambers carved into the AEO mountain, each revealing successively slower mechanisms as a visitor climbed upward through the shaft. The fastest moving components, a pendulum perhaps, or gears advancing daily, would be encountered first, near the base. As the visitor ascended a spiral staircase carved along the shaft wall, they would pass displays updating yearly, then by decade, then by century, and finally reach the slowest mechanism, a massive gear assembly that would complete one full rotation every 10,000 years, driven by the cumulative energy of all the faster stages below. This vertical sequence was not arbitrary but pedagogical, a deliberate attempt to make deep time legible through progressive deceleration. The spiral staircase, in these Nevada drawings, appears as a carved helix hugging the cylindrical void of the shaft. Its steps are dimensioned not for efficiency, a steep industrial spiral that minimizes travel distance, but for a ritual pace, with each tread wide enough and each rise low enough that climbers would naturally slow down, their attention drawn to the mechanisms visible through openings in the shaft wall. Landings are positioned at key intervals, providing rest and framing views of specific gear assemblies. Lighting is minimal, relying primarily on ambient daylight entering from above and perhaps from a few strategically placed apertures. The experience is imagined as moving from darkness toward light, from density toward openness, from the rapid flicker of human scale time toward the stillness of geological duration. Yet despite this detailed planning, the Nevada clock remained for years in the realm of surveys, acquisition papers, and funding appeals. The Long Now Foundation secured the land and continued refining the design, but the estimated cost of excavation, fabrication, and installation, tens of millions of dollars, far exceeded the foundation's budget. Meanwhile, the prototypes in San Francisco and London served a different function. They were accessible, human scale, and didactic. Visitors could watch them operate, read explanatory panels, and purchase memberships or books in the adjacent museum store. These prototypes demonstrated the clock's mechanical principles to thousands of people who would never hike to a remote Nevada mountain. The mountain clock, by contrast, was imagined as something harsh, remote, and deliberately difficult to reach. Long Now's own promotional materials described it as an icon for long-term thinking, a monument whose architecture would be defined not by spectacle or convenience, but by isolation and endurance. The journey to the site, a drive on unpaved roads followed by a hike up scree slopes at high elevation, was considered integral to the experience. The clock was not meant to be stumbled upon but sought out, visited only by those willing to invest the time and effort necessary to stand in its presence. This philosophy of access through difficulty echoed older pilgrimage traditions. The labyrinth walked on knees, the shrine reached only after fasting, the temple perched on a mountaintop. In this sense, the Nevada site represented an ideal but also a problem. Its remoteness protected the clock but also limited its audience to a small number of determined visitors. Its high elevation and harsh climate demonstrated the clock's resilience but also complicated maintenance and posed risks to anyone attempting the ascent in winter. The Foundation's vision was of a public monument, yet public access would necessarily be constrained by geography and logistics. Furthermore, the Foundation did not have the capital to begin construction. The site was owned, the design refined, the engineering validated, but the project could not proceed without a patron willing to fund it. Here, in these years of planning and waiting, the spiral staircase exists as a promise in limestone, not yet cut. It appears in architectural sections as a thin line of ascent, a path traced in drafting software and printed on large format sheets reviewed in Foundation offices and engineering consultancies. The steps have been dimensioned, their material properties calculated, their relationship to the mechanisms above carefully choreographed. But the stone itself remains unbroken, the mountain's interior still solid and dark. The staircase is real in every sense except the physical, engineered, cost, visualized, and waiting. The Long Now Foundation continued its broader cultural program during this period, hosting lecture series in San Francisco under the umbrella title Seminars About Long-Term Thinking, where speakers addressed topics from climate modeling to linguistic evolution to the design of nuclear waste warnings. These events, held in modest venues, attracted technologists, designers, and writers interested in questions of duration, legacy, and responsibility. The clock was frequently invoked as a symbol of the Foundation's mission, but it remained for most attendees an abstraction, something illustrated by photographs of the San Francisco prototype or by renderings of a mountain they would never visit. Without a patron capable of committing the necessary funds, the plans remained plans. Engineers refined gear tooth profiles in CAD software. Material scientists tested alloy compositions for corrosion resistance. The Nevada mountain waited, its limestone cliffs indifferent to the dreams projected onto them. The spiral staircase, carefully designed to guide future visitors through a monument to deep time, existed only in drawings and in the imaginations of those who believed such a monument was worth carving. That patron arrived in the form of Jeff Bezos. By 2009, test drilling had begun in a remote mountain near the town of Van Horn, Texas, in the Sierra Diablo range, on land Bezos owned as part of a vast private ranch several hours' drive from the nearest commercial airport. The site was not the Nevada mountain. Long Now retained those. Plans for a future public installation, but a parallel project, privately funded and privately sited, that would serve as the first full-scale realization of the 10,000-year clock concept. In a 2011 interview published in Wired magazine, Bezos confirmed that his investment firm, Bezos Expeditions, was committing at least $42 million to design, excavate, fabricate, and install this clock in the Texas mountain. The decision to build in Texas rather than Nevada reflected both practical and philosophical considerations. Bezos owned the land outright, eliminating lease negotiations and long-term access questions. The Texas site was at a lower elevation than Mount Washington, simplifying logistics and extending the construction season. And by funding a private installation first, Bezos allowed the Long Now Foundation to validate the full-scale design, train fabrication teams, and troubleshoot problems that would inform the eventual Nevada build. The Texas clock would be a prototype scaled to reality, not a demonstration model in a museum, but a working monument carved into stone. Alexander Rose, a trained industrial designer who had been involved with the Long Now project since its early years, took on the role of project manager. Working with a team that included Hillis, mechanical engineers, geotechnical specialists, and fabricators, Rose oversaw the translation of concept drawings into detailed construction documents, machining specifications, and site logistics plans. The Long Now Foundation's technical publications from this period describe a mechanism roughly 200 feet tall, installed inside a shaft approximately 500 feet deep, accessed via a horizontal tunnel that penetrates the mountain at an elevation about 1,500 feet above the valley floor. These dimensions, while approximate and sometimes reported with variation in press accounts, reflect the scale ambition. A clock taller than most buildings, hidden entirely inside a mountain, with its entrance visible only as a dark slot in the limestone cliff face. Geological surveys of the Texas site confirmed thick beds of stable limestone, minimal fracturing, and low groundwater infiltration, ideal conditions for underground construction. Engineers designed the shaft to be excavated vertically downward from the tunnel level, creating a cylindrical void roughly 12 to 15 feet in diameter, with the clock mechanism installed along the central axis and a spiral staircase carved into the perimeter wall. The excavation method combined drilling, controlled blasting, and hand finishing to achieve smooth walls and precise geometry. Spoil, the broken limestone removed during excavation, was hauled out through the entrance tunnel and dispersed across the ranch, leaving minimal surface disturbance. The clock mechanism itself was fabricated in specialized shops in Los Angeles and Seattle, with components machined from 316L stainless steel and titanium, chosen for their corrosion resistance, and mechanical properties. CAD models and finite element analysis software allowed engineers like Jascha Little to stress test gear teeth, bearing surfaces, and structural connections before any metal was cut. The main counterweight, reported to weigh approximately 10,000 pounds, was cut from stone and fitted with a titanium core for attachment to the winding mechanism. Visitors would eventually wind the clock by turning a capstan at the base of the shaft, lifting the weight incrementally. The stored gravitational potential energy would power the clock for a year or more, depending on the precision of its regulation systems. In photographs from the construction phase, preserved in Long Now's online archives and in case studies published by Autodesk and other engineering firms, the transformation from concept to reality becomes visible. Workers in harnesses and hard hats, suspended on ropes inside the shaft, use pneumatic tools to cut steps into the limestone wall. The staircase wraps in a tight helix around the void, each step slightly rough-edged but dimensioned for a consistent rise and run. Dust hangs thick in the air under work lights. The rock glows a warm buff orange, where fresh cuts expose clean stone, and darker gray-brown where dust and moisture have already begun to patina the surface. Steel beams and temporary scaffolding support workers as they drill anchor points for the clock's mounting system. Here, finally, the spiral staircase leaves paper and enters stone. It is no longer a line on a drawing, but a physical path, carved incrementally over months by a small crew working in difficult, confined conditions. Each step is cut individually, its depth and height adjusted slightly to follow the natural irregularities of the rock. There are no prefabricated components, no concrete pours, no steel treads bolted into place. The staircase is the mountain itself, selectively removed, its form emerging from absence. Workers climb it repeatedly, testing its solidity, wearing grooves into the stone even before the clock is installed or any symbolic first visitor arrives. This is the moment when the project becomes architecture in a very literal sense, not a device added to a building, but a building carved from a mountain, defined by stone, void, and circulation. The shaft is a room, its dimensions fixed by excavation limits and by the size of the mechanism it will contain. The staircase is a corridor, vertical rather than horizontal, wrapping around rather than extending linearly. And the tunnel entrance, though modest in dimension, perhaps 7 feet high and 6 feet wide, serves as the only facade, the single visible gesture of a monument otherwise entirely internal. The decision to build this clock on private land, shielded from casual access and controlled by a single owner, ties its physical endurance to the fortunes of an individual and a corporation. The shaft is engineered to last 10 millennia, with materials chosen for durability, and mechanisms designed for maintainability with simple tools. But the land above it is governed by contemporary legal structures, deeds, trusts, inheritance laws, corporate entities, none of which have yet been tested across spans of time longer than a few centuries. If Bezos' estate, or the foundation or corporation that eventually inherits stewardship, ceases to prioritize the site, the clock will remain in the mountain, but access may be lost. The entrance tunnel could be sealed, either deliberately or through neglect. The spiral staircase, carved with such care, might lead only into darkness, its steps worn by the boots of builders, but never by the pilgrims the designers imagined. This tension, between the clock's millennial ambition and its dependence on near-term continuity, is not unique to this project. Every long-lived monument has navigated it. Cathedrals survived because institutions maintained them across generations, even when those institutions transformed or faltered. Libraries endured because successive cultures chose to preserve them, even when the languages of their original texts were forgotten. The Texas clock assumes that someone in every generation for the next 400 generations will choose to care. That assumption may prove correct. Or the mountain may one day hold only a relic, visited by no one, its staircase intact but purposeless, a spiral into silence. By the early 2010s, as fabrication and installation progressed, the Texas clock began to take on a presence beyond its engineering specifications. In construction photographs released through Long Now's website and in technical case studies published by firms like Autodesk, which provided CAD software for the project, we see the first layers of the clock assembled inside the shaft, steel mounting frames bolted into the limestone walls, the massive stone counterweight suspended on titanium cables, and sections of the gear train lowered carefully down the shaft like liturgical objects being installed in a crypt. The work required coordination between fabricators, riggers, and engineers, with each component's dimensions constrained by the shaft's diameter and the tunnel's carrying capacity. Large pieces had to be transported across unpaved ranch roads, carried by hand or winched through the tunnel, and then lowered or raised into position within the vertical shaft. Access to the site required a day's hike from the nearest practical drop-off point, ascending scrubby limestone slopes through desert vegetation, yucca, agave, prickly pear, and thorny shrubs adapted to West Texas's extreme heat and minimal rainfall. The trail, if it could be called that, was deliberately unmarked, discouraging casual trespassers while allowing those with permission to navigate by GPS coordinates and distant landmarks. At roughly 500 feet of elevation gain above the valley floor, the terrain is steep enough to demand attention and fitness, but not technical climbing. Loose rock, sun exposure, and the absence of shade make the approach physically demanding, a deliberate inconvenience that Long Now and Bezos interpreted as part of the monument's meaning. Long Now's own descriptions of the eventual visitor experience, published in blog posts and design documents, read like stage directions for a performance of duration. One enters through the tunnel, a horizontal passage carved into the cliff face, minimally finished, with rough stone walls and a dusty floor. The tunnel extends perhaps several dozen feet before opening into the bottom of the vertical shaft. Here, the space transforms. The ceiling disappears upward into darkness or faint light, depending on the time of day. The clock mechanism rises along the central axis, its steel components catching whatever illumination filters down, and the spiral staircase begins, wrapping around the perimeter, ascending in a tight helix toward progressively slower displays and eventually toward a synchronization aperture where sunlight enters once each day to correct the clock's accumulated drift. The architecture is defined as much by absence as by form. There are no windows except the single solar aperture at the top, no artificial lighting except what visitors bring, no exterior facade beyond the tunnel entrance. The front of this building is the mountain itself, a ridgeline visible in photographs at sunset, the limestone glowing warm orange against a darkening sky. The entrance is almost invisible unless one knows exactly where to look. A shadow, a slight darkening in the cliff face, a void that reveals itself only from a narrow range of angles. This is not a monument designed to be seen from a distance and admired for its silhouette or ornament. Its monumentality is internal, revealed only to those who commit to the approach and step inside. Bezos's decision to place this monument on his private ranch rather than in a national park on public land or within a city where it might be incorporated into civic infrastructure means that unlike the gilded palaces and marble libraries of the Gilded Age designed to be seen and to announce the patron's status, this structure's grandeur is meant to be felt by a tiny number of future visitors willing to make the climb or secure an invitation. The patron's fortune, derived from a global retail and logistics empire, and later from cloud computing infrastructure that underpins much of the contemporary internet, is transmuted here into an underground sanctuary for contemplation, for slowing down, for confronting the inadequacy of human timescales. The mountain becomes, in this reading, a kind of 21st century estate, but one whose main house is invisible from the gate, whose rooms are stacked vertically rather than spread horizontally, and whose defining luxury is not marble or gold, but silence, darkness, and the slow tick of a mechanism designed to outlast nations. It is a retreat not from society. Bezos remains extraordinarily public and engaged in commerce, space exploration, and media ownership, but from the tyranny of the quarterly earnings cycle, the news cycle, the product cycle. The clock offers an alternative tempo, so slow as to be nearly imperceptible, a counterpoint to the world that made its patron wealthy. The spiral staircase carved into the shaft wall takes on a social meaning in this context. It is not just circulation, not merely a means of moving between levels. It is a filter, a test, a ritual ascent. Only those who commit to the hike across the ranch, only those granted access to the property, only those willing to climb in near darkness up stone steps cut by hand will see the full mechanism. In an age of instant access, streaming video, virtual tours, and democratized information, the most ambitious architectural project funded by one of the world's richest individuals is designed to be almost entirely unseen by the public. This is not accidental but essential to its philosophy. The clock resists reproduction, resists mediation, resists the logic of scale that defines Bezos's business empire. Yet this inaccessibility also generates a question that echoes through the project's media coverage and critical reception. For whom is this monument built? If it is a symbol for long-term thinking, as Bezos and Long now claim, then does its effectiveness depend on people actually visiting it? Or is the idea of the clock, circulated through articles, videos, and interviews, sufficient? If almost no one will ever walk the spiral staircase, does the staircase's existence still matter? Or has the monument already achieved its purpose simply by being described, by entering the cultural conversation, by prompting debates about duration, responsibility, and the role of private wealth in creating public symbols? From the limestone ridge at sunset, the site reveals almost nothing. A telephoto lens or a low-altitude aerial survey might detect the tunnel entrance, a dark slot perhaps 6 feet wide and 7 feet high. But even then, it reads as geological accident, a natural cave mouth, an erosion feature, an animal den, rather than as human intervention. The land around it is undeveloped, no visitor center, no parking area, no interpretive signs, no gift shop. The clock's grounds are the Chihuahuan Desert itself, a landscape of sparse rainfall, extreme temperature swings, and ecological communities adapted to scarcity. The monument's setting is not tamed or framed by landscape architecture, but left raw, allowing the mountain to remain, from the outside, essentially as it was before excavation began. This choice to build an architectural monument that announces itself only to those already committed enough to seek it out inverts the traditional relationship between patron and public. Most grand architectural projects are designed to be unavoidable, to dominate skylines, to force acknowledgement from passers-by. This one aspires to near invisibility, its presence known primarily through documentation rather than encounter. It exists in two states simultaneously, as a physical object inside a mountain in Texas and as a media object circulating through screens and pages worldwide. For most people, the latter is the only version they will ever experience. The spiral staircase, carved so carefully into stone, will remain for them an image, a description, a line in an article, a frame in a video, present in the cultural imagination but absent from physical memory. The engineering brief for the full-scale Texas clock reads like a manifesto of excess disciplined into precision. The mechanism, once completed, was designed to stand approximately 150 to 200 feet tall, installed within a shaft roughly 500 feet deep, with all components custom fabricated and tested to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch despite their massive scale. Some reports describe the main counterweight as the size of a small car, weighing approximately 10,000 pounds, cut from dense stone and fitted with a titanium attachment system strong enough to support the load through cycles of winding and unwinding across centuries. The clock's timekeeping logic is distributed across multiple gear stages, one that advances once per day, another once per year, a century hand that moves once every 100 years, and a special chime mechanism designed to sound once every 1,000 years, with a full cycle completing only once every 10 millennia. The fabrication drawings preserved in Longnau's technical archives specify 316L stainless steel for critical gears and structural components, chosen for its resistance to corrosion in the absence of maintenance and its ability to retain mechanical properties across wide temperature ranges. Titanium is used for high-stress connections where strength-to-weight ratio is critical. The surrounding limestone, rather than being treated as a mere container, is integrated into the design as passive environmental control. It buffers temperature swings, blocks ultraviolet radiation, and provides structural support without requiring foundations or reinforcement. The shaft walls themselves, carved to a diameter of perhaps 12 to 15 feet, are thick enough to withstand seismic events and strong enough to carry the load of mounting hardware without concrete anchors. One of the design's most striking features is its avoidance of lubricants, adhesives, and sealants that could degrade over time. Every bearing surface must operate dry or with minimal intervention. Gear teeth are cut with profiles that reduce sliding friction, favoring rolling contact where possible. Materials are selected not just for their immediate performance, but for their stability over centuries of neglect. The assumption is that no one may visit the clock for decades or longer, that ambient humidity and temperature will fluctuate within the shaft, and that dust will accumulate on all surfaces. The mechanism must tolerate this and continue functioning when a visitor finally returns to observe it. The clock's energy system reflects this same philosophy of resilient simplicity. Visitors are expected to wind the clock manually by turning a large capstan at the shaft's base, lifting the 10,000-pound counterweight incrementally and storing gravitational potential energy sufficient to power the mechanism for months or years. But if no visitors come, the clock does not stop. Instead, it draws energy from the daily temperature difference between the mountain's interior and the outside air. Longnau's technical descriptions explain that as the external temperature rises during the day and falls at night, this differential drives a small but reliable energy flow that can be captured and stored, slowly raising the counterweight or directly powering low-torque mechanisms. This passive energy harvesting is not efficient by industrial standards, but it is indefinite, requiring no fuel, no grid connection, no photovoltaic cells that might degrade. The clock will tick once per year, a tempo so slow that no visitor will witness it unless they arrive at precisely the right moment or wait for a full year inside the mountain. Its century hand will advance once every 100 years, an event that might be witnessed by a multi-generational family making pilgrimage across lifetimes. And the millennial chime, composed by Brian Eno to play a unique sequence of tones that will not repeat for 10,000 years, will sound so infrequently that it becomes an almost mythical event, something spoken of in historical records and anticipated in projections but experienced by vanishingly few human beings. The clock's rhythm is calibrated not to human attention spans, but to scales that feel geological, evolutionary, civilizational. This technical ambition is inseparable from moral questions that shadow the project. The widely reported cost of approximately $42 million funded entirely by Bezos is negligible compared to his net worth, which at various points has exceeded $100 billion but immense compared to the operating budgets of most public museums, educational institutions, and preservation organizations. To some observers, this is philanthropy in the key of deep time, an investment in a symbol that might outlive all contemporary structures and serve as a beacon for future civilizations. To others, it is a monument to inequality, a personal Stonehenge accessible to almost no one, carved with resources that could have addressed immediate human needs or supported public infrastructure. The architectural historian encounters a familiar dilemma here. Grand monuments have always required concentrations of wealth and power. Cathedrals were built with tithes extracted from peasants, and their beauty does not erase that extraction. Palaces were raised by enslaved or coerced labor, and their ruin does not redeem their origins. Museums were endowed by industrialists whose fortunes came from practices we now question or condemn. The Texas clock, by contrast, was built by paid workers using voluntarily contributed private funds, and it harms no one directly. Yet its existence raises the question, in an age of crumbling public infrastructure, mass homelessness, and deferred maintenance on libraries and schools, what does it mean for one individual to carve a private monument to 10,000-year thinking into a mountain no one else can visit? Long Now's response, articulated in blog posts, interviews, and public talks, is that the clock is not a personal monument but a public symbol, one that happens to be built with private funds on private land, but whose meaning is available to anyone. The prototypes in San Francisco and London are freely accessible. The design documents are published. The story of the clock, shared through media, reaches millions. The physical object in Texas is less important than the idea it represents, that humanity can and should think beyond quarterly earnings, election cycles, and individual lifetimes. The clock is offered as a tool for reframing conversations about climate, infrastructure, nuclear waste storage, and other challenges that unfold over scales longer than our political systems are designed to address. Critics counter that ideas require institutional support to endure, and that a monument dependent on a single family's continued interest is fragile regardless of its steel and stone. They note that Bezos's company, Amazon, is frequently criticized for labor conditions in warehouses, for aggressive tax minimization strategies, and for market dominance that harms small competitors. The juxtaposition of short-term extraction and long-term symbolism, they argue, reveals a disconnect. A patron who funds a monument to deep time while operating a business optimized for speed, scale, and disruption. The spiral staircase embodies this ambivalence. It is a feat of careful engineering, each step a precisely cut compromise between rock strength and human stride, shaped to guide visitors upward at a contemplative pace. Workers spent weeks carving it, suspended on ropes, chipping limestone dust that filled the shaft and coated their lungs. The result is elegant, functional, and durable. But it is also an axis of privilege, a vertical corridor funded by a single fortune, leading to a mechanism that most of humanity will never see. The clock's architecture makes a quiet claim that a private mountain can be turned into a public symbol if the owner wills it so, and if the mechanism survives long enough to outlive the memory of who paid for it. Whether this claim will be validated depends on questions that cannot yet be answered. Will the clock still be accessible in a century? Will future generations care enough to maintain it, or will it become a curiosity, then a ruin, then a forgotten shaft in a mountain owned by entities uninterested in clocks. The staircase will remain long after these. Questions are settled, its stone steps worn slowly by time or suddenly by abandonment, a monument to ambition that cannot control its own fate. In February 2018, Jeff Bezos posted a brief message to his Twitter account, accompanied by a time-lapse video. Installation has begun, 500 FT tall, all mechanical, powered by day-night thermal cycles, synchronized at solar noon. A symbol for long-term thinking, the B1000 year clock is coming together, the X to the genius of Danny Hillis, Xander Rose, and the whole clock team. The video, shot inside the Texas shaft, showed workers in hard hats and headlamps maneuvering heavy steel components, the camera angle emphasizing the vertical scale of the space. The post was retweeted thousands of times within hours and picked up by news outlets ranging from technology blogs to mainstream media. Within days, articles appeared on Space.com, Wired, Popular Mechanics, and the World Economic Forum's website, all describing a 500-foot-tall mechanical clock buried in a mountain owned by the world's richest man, designed to tick for 10,000 years. These articles, blog posts, television segments, and social media discussions functioned as the clock's first wave of widespread public exposure. They framed the project through multiple lenses: technological marvel, philosophical provocation, billionaire eccentricity, and moral questions. Some coverage was admiring, emphasizing the clock's ambition and the Long Now Foundation's mission to foster long-term thinking in an age dominated by short-term incentives. Other pieces were skeptical or critical, noting the timing. Bezos was simultaneously facing public scrutiny over Amazon's labor practices, its impact on retail employment, and controversies over HQ2 site selection and tax incentives. In one widely circulated opinion piece, a commentator argued that long-term thinking about climate, inequality, and infrastructure requires public policy and collective action, not private monuments on inaccessible ranches. The archival record from this period is largely digital: press kits distributed by Long Now, FAQ pages on the Foundation's website, engineering videos posted to YouTube and Vimeo, and interviews with project principals including Alexander Rose, Danny Hillis, and Stuart Brand. These materials, carefully curated, emphasize the clock's mechanical ingenuity, its roots in a decades-long intellectual project, and its potential to serve as an icon that reshapes public imagination around duration and responsibility. Renderings and construction photographs show the clock's interior. Visitors walking up the spiral staircase, their small figures dwarfed by the vertical sweep of the mechanism, light filtering from above onto brushed stainless steel surfaces, the stone counterweight suspended in darkness. Yet even in this media moment, the mountain's exterior remains almost featureless in published images. Aerial photographs show a limestone ridge indistinguishable from dozens of others. In the Sierra Diablo range, the entrance tunnel is not marked in these images, either because it is genuinely invisible from the angles chosen, or because its location has been deliberately obscured. All spectacle is reserved for the interior, for those granted access. The monument's public face is, paradoxically, its absence of one, a refusal to compete in the visual economy of skyscrapers, monuments, and branded architecture that defines most contemporary buildings at this scale of investment. This inversion generates narrative tension. The clock is described in nearly every article as a monument, a symbol, an icon, terms that traditionally imply visibility, accessibility, and public recognition. Yet the physical object resists all three. It is visible only to those who enter the shaft. It is accessible only with explicit permission and significant physical effort. And its recognition depends almost entirely on mediated representation rather than direct encounter. The question raised, implicitly or explicitly, in much of the coverage is whether a monument can function as a symbol if almost no one can visit it, or whether the idea of the monument circulated through storytelling is sufficient. In this sense, the 2018 announcement and the media attention it generated reveal the clock's dual existence. It is simultaneously a physical artifact under construction in Texas and a narrative artifact circulating through global information networks. For the small number of people who have visited the site, construction workers, engineers, Long Now staff, invited journalists, perhaps a handful of guests, the clock is a tangible, spatial, sensory experience. The cool of the stone shaft, the echo of voices, the faint metallic scent of steel, the vertigo of looking up into darkness. For everyone else, which is to say for the vast majority of people aware of the project, it is a story, a set of images, a conceptual provocation encountered on screens. The spiral staircase becomes, in this mediated context, a promotional image, a symbol of aspiration and ascent. In renderings released by Long Now, human figures climb the stairs, their posture slightly stooped as they navigate the helix, their attention drawn to mechanisms visible through openings in the shaft wall. The composition emphasizes vertical drama. The figures are small, the void is vast, and the stairs seem to spiral upward forever toward a vanishing point where light enters from above. This image, the lone climber ascending through stone toward enlightenment or understanding, draws on deep cultural archetypes: the pilgrim, the seeker, the initiate. It suggests that the clock offers not just information, the current year, the position of astronomical cycles, but transformation, a change in perspective achieved through effort and attention. But the coverage also hints at another narrative, one less comfortable for the project's advocates. Several articles note that there has been no announcement of a completion date or public opening. Interviews with Long Now staff describe the clock as an ongoing project requiring intermittent work by specialized teams and long intervals of planning between installation phases. Photographs from 2018 and 2020 show progress, more components installed, more of the mechanism visible, but also incompleteness. The project exists in a state of becoming, neither fully realized nor abandoned, sustained by continued funding and attention, but lacking the definitive milestone of a first official tick or a first public visitor. This temporal ambiguity is itself revealing. A monument designed to operate for 10,000 years has, in its first decade of physical construction, already entered a kind of limbo, present but not complete, functional but not open. Its progress is revealed in rare bursts of communication, a tweet, a blog post, a magazine profile, and then falls silent again, the work continuing out of public view or pausing for logistical, financial, or technical reasons. For those following the project, the rhythm of information feels sporadic, unpredictable, controlled. The clock, meant to provide a steady, reliable tick across millennia, currently offers only irregular updates, measured not in years but in the discretionary timing of announcements. The question lingers, unanswered in the articles and unaddressed in official communications. If a monument is designed to last 10 millennia but few will ever see it, and if its construction unfolds across years or decades without clear milestones, is it architecture, performance, or private myth? Is its primary function to exist as an object or to exist as an idea that circulates through conversation and imagination? And if the latter, does the physical object in the mountain matter at all, or is the project complete once it has entered public consciousness, regardless of whether the gears ever turn? The spiral staircase, carved into limestone with such care, waits in darkness for an answer. Alongside the mechanical and geological engineering, the clock's designers have treated time itself as an aesthetic medium, sculpting duration into something tangible and strange. Brian Eno's chime system, one of the project's most conceptually ambitious elements, is designed so that no sequence of bells will repeat for the full 10,000-year span. The system uses 10 chime rods of different lengths, struck by hammers controlled by a mechanical algorithm that generates a new permutation with each activation. The mathematics underlying this were worked out in collaboration with Hillis. With 10 bells arranged in sequences of varying length, the number of possible unique chimes exceeds the number needed for one per day across millennia. But the clock chimes not daily, but far more rarely, at intervals of years or centuries depending on which chime mechanism is triggered, ensuring that the sequences unfold at a pace matching the clock's Broader philosophy of extreme slowness. Eno, whose ambient music compositions have long explored duration, repetition, and the perception of time, approached the chime design as a kind of musical architecture. Each sequence, when it sounds, will be heard by at most a handful of people, and likely by no one at all for centuries at a stretch. The chimes are not meant to be recorded, broadcast, or reproduced. They are site-specific performances, events that occur whether or not anyone is present to witness them, woven into the mechanism's operation as thoroughly as the gears and bearings. The aesthetic is one of indifference to the audience, a radical departure from music's usual dependence on listeners. The clock chimes for itself, or for time itself, and humans are incidental. The clock's display system, visible in prototype form in the San Francisco and London installations, is intentionally unfamiliar to anyone accustomed to analog or digital timekeeping. Rather than hours and minutes, units that dominate human daily experience but dissolve into insignificance over centuries, the display emphasizes years, represented in 5-digit format, and slower astronomical cycles, the precession of the equinoxes, the phases of the moon, the positions of planets in their orbits. The dial face is not a circle marked with 12 divisions, but a complex arrangement of concentric rings, each advancing at its own rate, some imperceptibly slow. To read the clock is not to glance and immediately understand, but to study, to parse, to accept that one's intuitive sense of time is inadequate. Design documents describe a sequence of chambers or viewpoints within the Texas shaft, each associated with progressively slower mechanisms. Near the base, a visitor might encounter a pendulum or escapement that moves perceptibly, its swing or tick marking seconds or minutes. Ascending the spiral staircase, they pass displays that update daily, marking the rotation of the Earth. Higher still, yearly mechanisms advance with the planet's orbit around the Sun. At intermediate landings, century hands move so slowly that their motion is invisible within a human lifetime, detectable only by comparing the current position to historical photographs or records. And at the shaft's top, the millennial mechanism waits, its gear teeth so large and its advance so gradual that it might as well be motionless, a frozen monument to a future no living person will see. Light enters the shaft once a day via a carefully calculated aperture at the top, aligned to admit a beam of sunlight at local solar noon. This beam penetrates downward, illuminating dust motes suspended in still air, and strikes a sensor or target that corrects the clock's accumulated drift, synchronizing its internal regulation to the Earth's rotation. The moment when that beam reaches its mark is itself an architectural event, anticipated in design documents and renderings, a shaft of gold cutting through darkness, briefly, transforming the spiral staircase into a sundial, a light well, a cathedral nave. The rest of the day, and all through the night, the shaft returns to shadow, its mechanisms ticking or waiting in near total darkness. This aesthetic of deep time is inseparable from spiritual overtones, even as it carefully avoids invoking any formal religion. The clock borrows architectural language from sacred buildings across cultures: precession, ascent, the framing of light and darkness, the deliberate friction of a long approach that separates the site from ordinary experience. Visitors, if they come, are meant to feel small, not before a deity or doctrine, but before time itself, before the vast, incomprehensible span that precedes and will follow their brief flicker of consciousness. The architecture stages this encounter through scale, rhythm, and the stripping away of familiar reference points. Every element of the design reinforces this. The remoteness of the site ensures that no one arrives casually. The hike up the mountain is a prelude, a transition from everyday concerns to contemplative space. The tunnel entrance, low and rough, requires a slight bow or stoop, a physical gesture of entry that marks a threshold. Inside the shaft, the absence of artificial light means that vision adapts slowly, shapes emerging from darkness as eyes adjust. The staircase, carved into stone, ascends not in a straight flight but in a spiral, disorienting the visitor's sense of direction while maintaining the upward trajectory. And the clock itself, distributed vertically across hundreds of feet, can never be seen all at once. It must be experienced sequentially, incompletely, with each viewpoint offering only a fragment of the whole. Here, the spiral staircase becomes not just circulation or symbol, but liturgy. Each step is a count in a human-scale ritual designed to evoke a time scale beyond human life. The rhythm of climbing, breath, footfall, heartbeat, is the visitor's own duration, paced against the clock's near stillness. The visitor ascends through layers of temporal scale, from the rapid to the slow to the essentially frozen, and in doing so is meant to feel the inadequacy of their own frame of reference. This is the clock's pedagogy, delivered not through text or lecture, but through spatial experience and bodily effort. Yet all this choreography depends on fragile contingencies. It depends on continued funding and maintenance, on the assumption that the entrance will remain open, that the staircase will remain navigable, that someone will care enough to repair mechanisms when they fail. It depends on the stability of the social and political structures that define property ownership and inheritance. And it depends, most fundamentally, on future generations choosing to make the climb at all, to invest the time and effort required to stand in the shaft and contemplate the mechanism. If those contingencies fail, if access is lost, if maintenance lapses, if cultural priorities shift such that no one visits for centuries, then the aesthetic of deep time becomes a different kind of monument. The shaft will still contain the mechanism, the staircase will still spiral upward, the solar aperture will still admit light at noon. But the choreography will play to an empty room, the ritual will lack participants, and the clock will become not a living symbol, but a relic, a curious artifact discovered by some future civilization that may or may not understand what it was meant to do. The designers acknowledge this possibility. In interviews and writings, they describe the clock as a hope, not a guarantee. It is offered to the future as a gift, but the future is under no obligation to accept it. The aesthetic of deep time, so carefully constructed in steel and stone, is ultimately a bet on continuity, on the persistence of human curiosity and the value placed on symbols that resist the present's tyranny. Whether that bet pays out cannot be known until long after everyone involved in the project is dead. By the early 2020s, more than a decade after excavation began in the Texas mountains, the clock of the Long Now remained under construction. Updates from Long Now and occasional media coverage in 2018, 2019, and 2020 noted the progress of shaft completion, installation of major mechanical components, and fabrication of specialized parts in workshops scattered across the United States. But there has been no public announcement of the clock's completion, no first official tick marked by ceremony, no opening date for visitors. Interviews with Long Now staff describe an ongoing, complex project requiring highly specialized fabrication, intermittent on-site work by teams ranging from a few engineers to perhaps 40 workers during intensive installation phases, and long intervals of planning, fundraising, and problem-solving between active construction periods. In this sense, the clock has already entered a form of temporal ambiguity that complicates its identity as a monument. It exists. Photographs of the shaft interior, the installed counterweight, sections of gear train, and the spiral staircase attest to that. But it exists in a state of incompleteness, neither fully operational nor abandoned, sustained by continued investment, but lacking the definitive milestone that would allow it to be described in the past tense as built. For comparison, when the Eiffel Tower was completed for the 1889 Paris Exposition, its opening was immediate and public, its function clear. The clock, by contrast, is being built without a deadline, without a ceremonial unveiling, and with access controlled so tightly that even its state of completion is known only to those directly involved. Architecturally, this ambiguity is both unusual and revealing. Most buildings are constructed to a schedule, with occupancy or operation beginning as soon as possible to justify the investment. Delays are seen as failures, but the clock is designed for a 10,000-year lifespan, and its builders have adopted a temporal logic that treats decades of construction as an acceptable, even appropriate pace. There is no urgency because the clock's value is not diminished by waiting. A structure meant to outlast civilizations can afford to take its time coming into existence. Yet this slow pace also introduces risks. A project designed to outlast civilizations depends in its early decades on the continuity of a small number of entities. Bezos Expeditions, the Long Now Foundation, the fabrication firms holding institutional knowledge about custom components, the engineers and technicians who understand the clock's assembly and maintenance requirements. If any of these fail or shift priorities, the project could stall indefinitely. Unlike a public monument built and operated by a government agency or long-lived institution, the clock is sustained by discretionary funding and voluntary effort. It has no legal obligation to continue, no constituency that can demand its completion, no public accountability beyond reputation. This is not yet decay in stone, not yet the physical ruin that defines the final chapters of most architectural narratives. The shaft remains structurally sound, the installed components are presumably protected from weather and corrosion, and the staircase is fully carved and navigable. But there is a gap in narrative, a pause in progress that raises questions. If the clock were finished tomorrow, this decade-long construction phase would be remembered as deliberate, careful, appropriate to the scale of ambition. If construction ceased tomorrow and never resumed, this same period would be reinterpreted as a slow failure, a loss of momentum that foreshadowed abandonment. For now, neither interpretation is confirmed. The clock exists in suspension, a monument to future thinking that is itself waiting for its own future. The spiral staircase is fully cut, documented in photographs, walked by workers and the occasional journalist or guest. The shaft is lined and stable. The first stages of the clock mechanism gleam under work lights or in darkness, depending on whether anyone is present. But there are no regular visitors to wear the steps down, no daily ritual of winding to keep the counterweight moving, no accumulation of use that would transform the space from construction site to living monument. This pause, this silence, is itself a kind of disappearance. The clock has not vanished physically, but it has faded from public attention. After the initial wave of media coverage in 2018, mentions have become sporadic. The project no longer generates headlines. It is not forgotten. Searches online still return articles, videos, and the Long Now Foundation's project pages. But it has moved from active news to background context, from novelty to known quantity. For a monument designed to dramatize long-term thinking, this early slip into obscurity is ironic. The clock was meant to reshape how people think about duration, yet its own story has already entered a temporal gap where years pass without significant public update. The risk, subtle but real, is that this gap could widen. If another decade passes without completion, if Bezos's attention or funding shifts to other priorities, if Long Now's capacity is absorbed by other projects, the clock might remain indefinitely in this liminal state, partially built, partially functional, inaccessible, and gradually forgotten by all except a small circle of specialists and enthusiasts. It would still be there, in the mountain, its steel and stone intact. But the narrative momentum that gives monuments meaning, the story of their creation, their purpose, their place in culture, would dissipate. This is not an unprecedented fate. Architectural history is filled with projects that stalled, were never completed, or were completed so long after their original conception that their meaning had shifted beyond recognition. Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, begun in 1882, remains unfinished more than 140 years later. Sustained by tourism revenue and a foundation, its completion now projected for sometime in the 2020s or 2030s. The difference is that the Sagrada Familia is visible, visited by millions annually, its incompleteness itself a famous feature. The Texas clock, by contrast, is invisible to all but a handful of people, and its incompleteness is known only through the absence of announcements. The question facing the project now is not technical. The engineering challenges are solvable, given time and resources, but social and institutional. Will the network of people and organizations sustaining the clock remain committed through the decades required to finish it? Will Bezos or his heirs, or the entities that inherit stewardship, continue to prioritize a project whose return on investment is measured in centuries rather than years? Will Long Now maintain the technical expertise and cultural memory needed to complete and maintain the mechanism? These questions cannot yet be answered, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. A monument designed to outlast civilizations is, in its vulnerable early years, dependent on the fragile continuities of contemporary society. Donor commitment, institutional memory, legal structures, and cultural values that may shift unpredictably. The clock's designers anticipated many forms of threat: earthquakes, vandalism, climate change, the collapse of industrial civilization, but the most immediate risk may be the quietest: not destruction, but distraction; not opposition, but indifference; not catastrophe, but the simple, slow fading of attention that lets projects drift indefinitely. The spiral staircase, fully carved and waiting, embodies this ambiguity. It is complete in itself, a functional path from the shaft's bottom to its top, ready to be climbed. Yet it leads for now to a mechanism that may not be finished, to a clock that may never tick, to a monument whose meaning depends on a future not yet secured. The steps are there. The question is whether anyone will ever have a reason to climb them. To understand what may happen to the Texas clock over centuries, historians of technology and architecture look backward to the fates of earlier timepieces that aspired to permanence. Mechanical clocks built in the 14th and 15th centuries, installed in cathedrals and civic towers across Europe, have survived in some cases for 600 or 700 years, a respectable span, though less than a tenth of the Long Now's 10,000-year ambition. The clock at Salisbury Cathedral in England, dating to approximately 1386, is often cited as one of the oldest working examples. It has survived not because its mechanism is indestructible, but because institutions maintained it, restoring and restarting it after long intervals of disuse, replacing worn parts, and eventually, in the 20th century, treating it as a heritage artifact worthy of preservation even after it ceased to serve any practical function. The lesson from Salisbury and similar survivors is that longevity depends less on the initial quality of materials than on continuous or at least periodic institutional care. The clock's iron gears, wooden frame, and stone weights were not inherently superior to those of many clocks that did not survive. What Salisbury had was a cathedral chapter and later secular preservation organizations committed across generations to keeping it functional or at least intact. When resources were scarce, the clock might be neglected for decades. When interest revived, it was repaired. The mechanism's survival was not automatic, but contingent on each generation choosing to value it. By contrast, many ambitious 19th-century timepieces, grand astronomical clocks displayed at international expositions, elaborate tower clocks installed in municipal buildings, and mechanized displays combining clockwork with sculpture or automation, fell silent after a few decades. Preservation reports and museum catalogs document their dispersal. Movements were stripped for scrap metal during wars or economic depressions. Towers were repurposed for other uses, the clock faces removed or painted over. Components deemed too specialized to maintain were simplified, replaced with cheaper mechanisms, or removed entirely. In many cases, only fragments survived: a single gear preserved in a museum, a photograph in an archive, a local historical society's description of the Old Town Clock. In each case, architecture and mechanism parted ways. The stone tower remained, a prominent vertical landmark that continued to define the skyline or anchor a public square. The clock face, often made of durable materials like slate or metal, might persist for decades after the mechanism behind it had failed, becoming a frozen image that no longer told time but still signaled the building's original purpose. But the internal machinery, the gears, escapements, weights, and pendulums that constituted the clock's functional heart, was the most vulnerable component precisely because it was mechanical, complex, and dependent on maintenance. The clock of the Long Now is consciously designed against this pattern of obsolescence. The Long Now Foundation's design philosophy specifies that all components must be serviceable with simple tools, that materials must be chosen for corrosion resistance and durability without maintenance, and the documentation must be archived widely to ensure future generations can understand and repair the mechanism even if no one alive remembers its construction. Prototypes in London and San Francisco serve as working models, publicly accessible and demonstrating the clock's mechanical principles at a scale that can be maintained by museum staff with modest budgets. These prototypes, in theory, will long outlast any private ranch or foundation, protected by institutional missions focused on education and preservation. Yet, the Texas clock is also, today, structurally dependent on one patron's land and a small foundation's organizational culture. If Bezos' estate, or the entities that inherit stewardship of the Sierra Diablo property, cease to prioritize public or even restricted access, the clock could be sealed off deliberately or through neglect. The entrance tunnel could be blocked by rockfall or intentionally closed for liability reasons. The property could be sold to buyers with no interest in hosting a monument to long-term thinking. Legal disputes, inheritance complications, or shifts in corporate strategy could eliminate the fragile chain of permissions and resources that currently sustains the site. Similarly, if the Long Now Foundation dissolves, loses funding, or shifts focus, the institutional knowledge required to maintain the clock, the CAD files, the fabrication specifications, the maintenance procedures, could scatter or disappear. While the Foundation has made efforts to archive this information, digital archives themselves require maintenance. File formats become obsolete, servers fail, backups are lost or corrupted. Without active stewardship, documentation degrades as surely as physical artifacts. In this imagined future scenario, acknowledged as possible by the designers themselves, the spiral staircase becomes a different kind of monument. It would still exist, carved into stone, structurally sound and navigable. But it would lead to a clock that no longer ticks, or whose ticking goes unobserved, or whose mechanisms have seized from lack of winding and lubrication. Alternatives have failed. The shaft would become, in effect, a mechanical tomb, a sealed chamber containing a relic of early 21st century ambition, accessible perhaps to archaeologists or explorers of a later era who cut through the blocked entrance and discover, in the darkness, a staircase spiraling around, a silent machine. This is not a scenario of catastrophic collapse. No earthquake shatters the gears, no war destroys the mountain, but of quiet abandonment. The clock does not explode or burn, it simply stops and no one restarts it. Over decades or centuries, dust accumulates on the steel surfaces. Moisture seeping through limestone joints causes gradual oxidation despite the stainless steel's resistance. Bearings that were designed to operate dry develop irregular wear patterns from thermal expansion and contraction. The counterweight, suspended on titanium cables, hangs motionless, its potential energy never converted back into motion. And the solar synchronization beam continues to enter at noon, illuminating dust motes and striking a sensor no longer connected to anything that responds. This is the fate of many ambitious mechanisms, not destruction, but silence, not disappearance, but dormancy. The clock remains, but its ticking stops. The architecture persists, but the ritual it was designed to support, the periodic winding, the observation of slow mechanisms, the chiming of bells, ceases. Future visitors, if any come, would find a monument to intention rather than achievement, a staircase that climbs toward a machine that no longer measures time, a cathedral whose deity has departed. The difference between the Texas clock and earlier, failed timekeeping monuments is one of scale and explicitness. The clock was designed with 10 millennia in mind. Its failure to reach even a single millennium would be measured against that stated ambition, and the disappointment would be proportionally greater. A 14th century town clock that survived 400 years exceeded its maker's realistic expectations. A clock designed for 10,000 years that survives only 400 would be seen, rightly or not, as a failure of vision, a monument that collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. Whether this will happen cannot be known. The clock may thrive, maintained across centuries by institutions not yet imagined, its mechanisms tended by engineers speaking languages not yet evolved. Or it may fall silent within a human lifespan, becoming another entry in the long catalog of ambitious projects that overestimated their own durability. The spiral staircase, carved so carefully into stone, will outlast the mechanism either way, a permanent path to a temporary machine. For now, the most accessible version of the Texas clock exists not in the shaft beneath the Sierra Diablo ridge, but in its representations, engineering renderings, press photographs, construction videos, and the smaller-scale working prototypes installed in museums in San Francisco and London. The underground city, suggested in some breathless headlines and video thumbnails, implying a labyrinth of chambers, a network of tunnels, a hidden complex inside the mountain, is, in reality, a highly focused architectural volume. A single vertical shaft approximately 500 feet deep and 12 to 15 feet in diameter, with a spiral staircase carved into its perimeter and a clock mechanism occupying the central axis. The contrast between the imagined vastness suggested by underground city and the actual disciplined geometry of the design is itself revealing, a gap between metaphor and fact that characterizes much of the clock's public reception. Bezos's mountain, despite years of construction and millions of dollars invested, is not open to casual tourism. There is no visitor center at the base of the trail, no parking area with interpretive signage, no published schedule for tours, no booking system through which interested members of the public can request access. Instead, the clock enters public consciousness as a kind of mythic infrastructure, frequently referenced in articles about long-term thinking, deep time, and eccentric billionaire projects, but rarely visited or verified by independent observers. Journalists granted access to publish accounts emphasizing the hike's difficulty, the shaft's impressive scale, and the clock's mechanical elegance, but these accounts are few, controlled, and mediated through Longnow's public relations framework. This controlled visibility means that for the vast majority of people aware of the clock's existence, knowledge comes not from direct encounter, but from curated images and descriptions. Articles describe it as hundreds of feet tall, buried in a mountain, designed to tick for 10,000 years, but few readers can specify the texture of the limestone underfoot, the acoustic properties of the shaft, the precise color of the steel under work lights, or the bodily sensation of climbing the spiral staircase. These details remain proprietary, accessible only to the small circle of people who have physically entered the site. In this sense, the architectural object has already begun to vanish into narrative, even as it continues to exist physically. The clock is simultaneously hyper-documented, featured in design magazines, engineering case studies, conference presentations, and popular media, and fundamentally hidden. Its documentation circulates widely, but the thing itself is withdrawn. The spiral staircase that workers climb during installation phases, that engineers use to access different sections of the mechanism, may one day be climbed by invited visitors or even by a broader public if access policies change. Or it may exist, in the long term, only in photographs, CAD models, and the memories of those who built it. This dual existence, physical object and media artifact, is not unique to the clock, but the gap between the two is unusually wide. Most public monuments are designed to be encountered. Their locations are marked on maps, their hours of operation published, their entrances visible and welcoming. Even remote monuments, like the Crazy Horse Memorial in South Dakota or the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, are accessible via developed infrastructure and marketed to tourists. The Texas clock, by contrast, resists this logic. Its location is known only approximately. Access is by permission. There are no operating hours because there is no operation open to the public. The monument is present in the world but functionally absent from public space. This represents a different kind of disappearance than demolition or decay. The clock has not been torn down, and its components are not rusting into illegibility. But it has disappeared from the realm of common experience, existing instead as an idea people encounter through screens, articles, and conversations. The architecture is mediated, filtered through the perspectives of those granted access and through the visual language chosen to represent it. A visitor reading about the clock online sees what the Longnow Foundation, Bezos, and the journalists they cooperate with choose to show: dramatic upward shots of the shaft, close-ups of polished gears, distant views of the mountain at sunset, renderings of imagined future visitors ascending the staircase. What they do not see is equally revealing. The mundane logistics of construction, the temporary scaffolding and equipment, the moments when things go wrong, the budget spreadsheets, the disagreements over design details, the contracts and legal frameworks governing access. The clock is presented as a finished idea, even while it remains an unfinished object. This presentation shapes its meaning, framing it as a philosophical monument rather than an engineering project, as a symbol rather than a building site. For most of its intended audience, the clock's primary cultural presence is, and may always be, mediated rather than direct. The physical shaft in Texas serves as an anchor for a narrative that circulates far more widely than anyone will ever circulate through the shaft itself. The monument functions less like a cathedral, which one visits, than like a myth, which one hears about. And myths, while powerful, are also fragile. They depend on continuous retelling, on each generation finding them worth repeating. If the story of the clock ceases to be told, if articles stop being written, videos stop being shared, references fade from public conversation, then the physical object may remain in the mountain, but its cultural presence will have disappeared as surely as any demolished building. This is a form of disappearance particular to the media age, not erasure, but obscurity, not destruction, but irrelevance. The clock would still exist, carved into stone and steel, a functioning mechanism or a dormant one, depending on whether maintenance continues. But if no one knows it is there, if no one remembers why it was built, if the ideas it was meant to embody have been superseded or forgotten, then its existence becomes trivial. A monument in a mountain that no one visits and no one discusses is, for all practical purposes, not a monument at all. It is an artifact waiting to be discovered or waiting to be ignored indefinitely. The spiral staircase in this scenario would persist as a physical fact, stone steps winding upward in darkness, but its meaning would have evaporated. It would be a staircase to nowhere, or more precisely, a staircase to a machine whose purpose is no longer culturally legible. Future visitors, if any came, might marvel at the engineering, might photograph the gears and the shaft's vertical drama, but they would do so as archaeologists or curiosity seekers rather than as participants in the ritual the designers intended. The clock was designed to stretch our sense of time, to make us confront the inadequacy of short-term thinking. But in its current state, it stretches our sense of distance instead, existing as an architectural project that most of its intended audience will never physically approach. Whether this distance is a strength, protecting the clock from the erosion of mass tourism, or a weakness, allowing it to fade into irrelevance, depends on outcomes not yet determined. The monument is here, in Texas, under stone, but its meaning circulates elsewhere, in networks and conversations and imaginations, and that circulation may prove more fragile than steel. While the Texas installation remains remote, unfinished, and inaccessible to the public, the prototypes and models scattered across institutions have already assumed the role of architectural fragments, stand-ins for a monument most people will never visit. In San Francisco's Fort Mason Center, the Long Now Museum and Store houses two working clock prototypes. One, a shoulder-height mechanism roughly 8 feet tall, was the first to complete a full-year cycle transition on 31st of December 1999. Marking the turn from 9999 to 2000 in front of the witnesses who gathered to see whether the untested design would function as intended. Another, more refined and installed behind glass, displays the characteristic 5-digit year format, the slow advance of astronomical indicators, and the precise mechanical logic that will, in the Texas mountain, be scaled to a height of 200 feet. In London, the Science Museum's permanent collection includes a prototype commissioned specifically for public display. Standing approximately 2 meters tall, it is visually striking. Polished metal components exposed behind clear panels, gears cut with exaggerated clarity so visitors can follow the mechanical reasoning, and a dial face that rejects conventional clock iconography in favor of unfamiliar symbols and scales. Educational materials accompanying the display explain its connection to the Texas project. showing photographs of the Sierra Diablo mountain at sunset and sectional diagrams of the full-scale clock buried inside. School groups gather around it, docents lead tours, and visitors photograph it, none of them aware that they are seeing not a miniature reproduction, but a fully functional instance of the same design, simply built at a scale manageable within a museum gallery. These devices are to the Texas shaft what a fragment of a column, removed from a demolished temple and displayed in a museum courtyard, is to the vanished building it once supported. They are real parts of the project, not models or illustrations, but they are severed from the context that gives the full design its meaning. The prototypes can be walked past in seconds. They sit in climate-controlled rooms with steady lighting and no vertical drama. Visitors do not hike to reach them, do not climb stairs carved in stone, do not stand at the bottom of a 500-foot shaft feeling the weight of rock above. The prototypes demonstrate the mechanism, but they cannot convey the experience the Texas clock is designed to create. Curatorial texts, museum catalogs, and visitor guides bridge this gap by situating the prototypes within a larger narrative. They describe the Long Now Foundation's mission, the concept of the 10,000-year clock, the choice to build one in a Texas mountain, and the role these smaller versions play as both proof of concept and public education tools. Photographs of the Sierra Diablo site are displayed alongside the prototypes, showing the mountain at dusk, the tunnel entrance as a dark void in the cliff, and construction images of the shaft interior. Technical drawings in the exhibit materials include the characteristic spiral staircase, a thin helix wrapping the sectional view, marking the imagined path future visitors might follow if access ever becomes available. The prototypes are small enough to maintain with museum budgets, transparent enough for school children to understand within minutes, and protected by institutions whose missions include public education and long-term preservation. The Science Museum in London has existed since 1857 and manages collections dating back centuries. Its organizational continuity vastly exceeds that of most private foundations or family estates. Fort Mason, operated by a nonprofit organization in partnership with the National Park Service, benefits from similar institutional stability. If the Long Now Foundation dissolved tomorrow, if the Texas clock was sealed and forgotten, these prototypes would likely persist, maintained as part of broader collections focused on the history of timekeeping and mechanical engineering. In the language of architectural history, one might say that the clock project exists simultaneously in three forms: as a conceptual brief for deep time thinking, articulated in essays and lectures; as an underground construction site in Texas, physically present but functionally inaccessible; and as a set of museum-scale fragments on public display in San Francisco and London. The fragments, paradoxically, may be the most durable and most visited component of the project. They are not the real clock in the sense that the Texas installation is meant to be the definitive realization, but they are real clocks, functioning according to the same principles, built by the same team, and open to anyone willing to visit a museum. The spiral staircase motif recurs even in these fragment spaces. Museum graphics and explanatory panels often feature sectional diagrams of the Texas shaft, and the staircase is always visible. A thin line ascending along the shaft wall, tiny human figures drawn at intervals to indicate scale. Visitors to the prototypes in San Francisco or London studying these diagrams encounter the staircase as an idea, a representation, a promise of an experience they will almost certainly never have. The staircase exists for them as it existed in the earliest 1990s design documents, as ink, as pixels, as imagination. The difference is that now it also exists in stone, cut into a mountain they cannot visit, real but unreachable. If the Texas clock never fully opens to the public, if it remains indefinitely in a state of controlled inaccessibility, or if it is eventually abandoned, these fragments may become the primary physical legacy of the entire project. Future historians, studying the Long Now Foundation's attempt to build a 10,000-year clock, would have these prototypes to examine, measure, and preserve. They would have documentation, photographs, engineering drawings, and published accounts. But the Texas clock itself might become a footnote, an ambitious attempt that stalled or failed, its shaft intact but forgotten, its mechanism silent, its staircase unwalked, except by the few who built it. This would not be the first time a grand architectural vision was realized primarily through fragments and representations rather than through a completed monument. Many of the most influential unbuilt architectural projects, Etienne Louis Boulet's cenotaph for Isaac Newton, Frank Lloyd Wright's mile-high skyscraper, visionary city plans by Santolaya and others, exist only as drawings, models, and the ideas they inspired. They shaped architectural discourse and influenced later designers without ever being constructed. The Texas clock occupies an ambiguous position between these categories. It is being built, which places it beyond pure speculation, but its inaccessibility and uncertain completion mean that its influence may ultimately derive more from the idea it represents than from the physical object itself. The prototypes in San Francisco and London ensure that the idea remains tangible. They offer proof that the mechanism can work, that the design philosophy is sound, that a clock optimized for 10,000-year duration is not fantasy but engineering. And they serve as proxies, allowing thousands of visitors annually to encounter the project in a form they can understand and appreciate. In this sense, the fragments succeed where the monument struggles. They are accessible, educational, maintained, and open. They fulfill the clock's mission to foster long-term thinking more effectively than a shaft buried in a private mountain ever could. The irony is that the fragments were never meant to be the primary artifact. They were demonstrations, stepping stones toward the real thing. But in the gap between intention and outcome, between the plan and the reality, the fragments have assumed an importance the designers did not anticipate. They remind us that grand architectural ambitions can devolve into a handful of accessible artifacts, and that sometimes those fragments carry the idea more effectively than the inaccessible whole. Beyond the clock itself, the Long Now Foundation has cultivated a broader cultural program designed to make long-term thinking not just a slogan, but a practice woven into multiple domains of inquiry. The Foundation hosts a lecture series, formally titled Seminars About Long-Term Thinking, that has featured speakers ranging from scientists and technologists to historians, writers, and policymakers. Topics addressed include climate modeling across centuries, the design of nuclear waste warnings legible to distant future civilizations, the preservation of endangered languages, and the ethics of decisions whose consequences unfold over timescales longer than any government or corporation has yet existed. These lectures, recorded and archived, are available online, extending the Foundation's reach far beyond the few hundred attendees who gather in San Francisco for each event. Another Long Now initiative, the Rosetta Project, aims to create a contemporary analog to the Rosetta Stone by archiving as many human languages as possible in a durable analog format that could survive digital obsolescence. The project has produced a 3-inch nickel disc, etched using microengraving technology, containing texts in over 2,500 languages. The disc is readable with low-powered magnification and requires no electricity, software, or decryption keys. Copies are distributed to libraries, museums, and archives worldwide, with the hope that if future civilizations lose access to current linguistic knowledge, they might recover it through these physical artifacts. The Rosetta Disc, like the clock, is a monument to duration, but one that fits in a hand rather than requiring a mountain. In this sense, the clock is both an object and an emblem, a physical anchor for a broader intellectual project. Stuart Brand, co-founder of Long Now and author of several books exploring themes of time, durability, and responsibility, has compared the clock's hoped-for cultural effect to that of the first photographs of Earth from space. Those images, captured during Apollo missions in the late 1960s, became icons that reshaped environmental consciousness, making the planet's fragility and unity visible in a way that no amount of data or description could achieve. Brand and others involved with Long Now hope the clock might function similarly, An image, an idea, a strange and striking object that forces people to confront the inadequacy of short-term frameworks. Architecturally, this ambition manifests not only in the Texas mountain, but in modest, accessible spaces. The Interval, a bar and cafe in San Francisco that opened in 2014, serves as a public face for Long Now. Located at Fort Mason, it features one of the working clock prototypes installed prominently in the main room, its gears visible behind glass, its 5-digit year display slowly advancing. The Interval's design, wood tables, comfortable seating, shelves of carefully curated books focused on long-term topics, creates an environment intended to slow down visitors, to encourage conversation and contemplation rather than quick transactions. It is a space designed to embody the Foundation's philosophy at human scale, in daily practice, accessible to anyone willing to buy a drink or attend an event. These spaces, lecture halls, the Interval's reading room, the small exhibition area housing prototypes, are intentionally human scale, socially porous, and open in a way the mountain clock is not. They do not require a day's hike or an invitation from a billionaire. They welcome casual visitors, host public events, and integrate Long Now's ideas into the ordinary rhythms of urban life. Together, they form a distributed estate of ideas, with the underground clock in Texas as its grand, nearly mythical main house, and these smaller spaces as the accessible cottages and gardens where most engagement actually occurs. The tension between these two scales is instructive. The spiral staircase in the Texas shaft dramatizes ascent into deep time, wrapping around a 500-foot void, demanding physical effort and offering spatial drama. But it remains inaccessible to almost all of Long Now's audience, functioning primarily as an aspirational image in articles and renderings. Meanwhile, the staircase in the Interval, a simple flight of steps between the ground floor cafe and an upper mezzanine, is climbed hundreds of times per week by patrons moving between seating areas. It is utterly mundane, its design unremarkable. Yet more people will climb those few steps in a single year than will likely ever walk the Texas spiral across decades or centuries. This disparity raises a question about where the real work of fostering long-term thinking occurs. Is it in the monumental gesture, the ambitious symbol carved into a mountain, designed to last millennia and visible only to a select few? Or is it in the daily accumulation of smaller actions, attending lectures, reading books, engaging in conversations, supporting institutions, making decisions informed by awareness of longer timescales? The clock offers the former. Spaces like the Interval and the broader Long Now programming offer the latter. Both are valuable, but they operate by different logics and reach different audiences. The architecture of deep time, it turns out, may be less about monumental stone than about the habits and practices fostered in ordinary rooms and sustained by accessible institutions. The Texas clock is spectacular, but the Interval is open Tuesday through Sunday. The clock will, if it is maintained, tick for 10,000 years. But Long Now's lecture series has been running for over 2 decades and has already influenced thousands of people. The clock is unique, but the Rosetta disk has been replicated and distributed, ensuring redundancy. The clock depends on one patron's fortune. Long Now's operations are supported by memberships, donations, and earned revenue, a more distributed and resilient funding model. In that light, Bezos's mountain clock becomes one voice among many in a broader conversation about how societies remember, anticipate, and plan. Its extremity, a 10,000-year promise carved in rock, funded by one individual, hidden in a private mountain, throws into relief the quieter, more dispersed architectures of responsibility that must accompany it. If the clock succeeds in fostering long-term thinking, it will not be because future visitors climb its staircase, but because the idea of the clock and the broader Long Now program it anchors has shaped how people and institutions approach questions of duration, legacy, and responsibility. This is an uncomfortable realization for those who have invested in the physical monument. It suggests that the clock's value is less intrinsic than symbolic, that the Texas shaft could remain forever sealed, and the project could still be considered successful if the conversations and ideas it has generated continue to influence decision-making. The physical clock, in this reading, is less a functional necessity than an expensive, elaborate piece of conceptual art, a provocation that derives its power not from its mechanism, but from the questions it forces us to ask. Whether this diminishes or justifies the project depends on perspective. To some, it validates the investment. If a 42 million clock prompts discussions worth billions in better infrastructure planning, climate policy, or cultural preservation, then it is a bargain. To others, it exposes a contradiction. If the physical clock is not essential, why build it at all? Why not invest those resources directly in the institutions, programs, and policies that foster long-term thinking? The spiral staircase, once again, embodies the ambiguity. It is carved carefully into stone, a path meant to be walked. But if its primary function is symbolic, to exist in photographs and inspire metaphors about ascent and effort, then the stone itself may be unnecessary. An illustration would suffice. The fact that it is real, that someone can theoretically climb it, adds authenticity, but it also adds cost, complexity, and fragility. The question remains, in an architecture of deep time, what is essential and what is merely impressive? The documentary returns, finally, to the ridge above Van Horn, Texas, where this inquiry began. The sun has moved across the sky. Afternoon light now strikes the Sierra. Diablo slopes at a lower angle, lengthening shadows and emphasizing the texture of limestone. From a helicopter shot or from the vantage of a distant ridge across the valley, the mountain surface still reveals almost nothing. A faint trace might mark where the access road cuts across the slope, visible only to those who know to look for it. But even this is ambiguous. It could be a dry wash, a game trail, a geological fault. The tunnel mouth, the entrance to the shaft and the staircase, and the clock within, remains invisible at this distance, a shadow indistinguishable from countless other shadows cast by overhangs and fissures in the rock face. Inside, 500 feet below the ridgeline, the spiral staircase winds upward in silence. Whether the clock is fully assembled, partially operational, or still waiting on future installation phases, the stone steps are complete and navigable. They bear the marks of boots and equipment, scuff marks where heavy components were maneuvered past tight corners, dust accumulated in the protected inner curve of each tread, perhaps faint scratches where harnesses or ropes dragged against the wall. The rock here is cool to the touch, insulated by the mountain's mass from the desert heat above. Dust hangs in still air, disturbed only when someone enters the shaft and begins to climb, their movement pushing air upward in a slow draft. At intervals along the ascent, where the staircase passes openings in the shaft wall, glimpses of the clock mechanism appear. Steel gears larger than a human torso, their teeth precisely cut and catching whatever light filters down from above. A section of the counterweight system, cables disappearing into darkness both above and below. A platform or mounting bracket bolted into the limestone, awaiting components not yet installed or already in place and silent. These glimpses are fragmentary, partial views of a system whose full logic reveals itself only through cumulative ascent. No single viewpoint allows a visitor to see the entire mechanism. It must be experienced sequentially, step by step, with understanding building as elevation increases. Near the top of the shaft, where the staircase approaches the solar synchronization aperture, light enters in a narrow beam. On a clear day at local solar noon, this light penetrates hundreds of feet downward, illuminating dust motes suspended in the still air, turning the shaft briefly into a light well, a vertical corridor from surface to depths. The beam strikes a polished surface or sensor at a precise point, calibrated to correct the clock's accumulated drift. For this moment, perhaps lasting minutes as the sun moves across its narrow angle of entry, the mountain becomes a giant sundial, its external face irrelevant, its internal geometry aligned to astronomical reality. Then the beam shifts, the light fades, and the shaft returns to shadow. In this narrow band of light, if one were standing at the right elevation, one could imagine, as the designers intended, a future visitor pausing, listening, not for the tick of seconds, which would be inaudible even if the clock ran at that speed, but for the once-a-year tick that marks the Earth's completion of another orbit. This is the sound the mechanism is meant to produce if maintained and wound. A single deliberate pulse, mechanical and resonant, echoing briefly in the shaft before silence returns for another 12 months. No visitor will hear this by accident. To witness it requires planning, commitment, arrival at a specific time, and the luck or patience to be present when the mechanism releases its stored energy for a fraction of a second. From an architectural historian's vantage in the present, the mountain is now a kind of frozen question. It asks whether a private monument, funded by a single fortune and controlled by a single owner, can, over millennia, behave more like a cathedral than like a folly. Cathedrals were built by communities, maintained by institutions, and embedded in cities where their presence was unavoidable. Follies were built by individuals, often left to decay after their patrons died, and located on private estates where they served primarily as curiosities. The Texas clock shares characteristics of both. It has a cathedral's ambition and symbolic purpose, but a folly's inaccessibility and dependence on one patron's whim. The question cannot yet be answered. It depends on future caretakers, on whether they continue to climb the staircase, wind the weight, repair worn parts, and most fundamentally, whether they choose to grant access to visitors who might come seeking connection to deep time. It depends on legal structures that survive or evolve, on institutions that persist or are replaced, and on cultural values that may shift in directions impossible to predict. The estate, if we can call it that, consists of a shaft, a staircase, a machine, and a story. The shaft is carved in stable stone. The staircase is complete. The machine exists, at least in part, and could in theory be finished and maintained. But the story, the narrative that gives the mountain meaning beyond its geology, is fragile, dependent on retelling, vulnerable to forgetting. The film closes not on a triumphant chime, not on the satisfaction of a finished monument unveiled to public acclaim, but on stillness. An aerial view at dusk shows the ridge as the sun drops toward the western horizon, light draining from the slopes, the limestone cooling from orange to gray to shadow. Wind moves over scrub vegetation, creosote, yucca, sparse grasses adapted to scarcity. No sound suggests the machinery below. No sign marks the entrance. The mountain, to the casual observer, is simply a mountain, one peak among many in a long range, distinguished by nothing visible from this height. The same mountain could, in another age or under different ownership, have held a mine, extracting silver or copper until the deposits were exhausted, leaving behind only tailings and abandoned shafts. It could have held a monastery, built by a religious order seeking isolation, maintained for generations, eventually abandoned as the order dispersed or died out. It could have held a military installation, a listening post or bunker carved into strategic high ground, its function classified during its operation, its equipment removed when it was decommissioned. Or it could have held nothing, simply remained as it had been for millions of years, shaped by erosion and tectonics, hosting the sparse ecology of the high desert, witnessed only by occasional hikers or ranchers crossing the landscape. Now it holds a clock whose success cannot be measured by its first years of operation or even its first century, but by whether, centuries or millennia from now, someone still chooses to climb the spiral staircase and listen. Every monument built to defy time eventually becomes history, a relic studied rather than used, an artifact rather than a living presence. The clock of the long now is unique in that it admits this truth in advance, carving its confession into the rock itself. It was designed to outlast civilizations, but it cannot force those civilizations to care. It can only wait, ticking or silent, while the mountain above it weathers, and the story of why it exists is either remembered or forgotten. The staircase remains, spiraling upward in darkness, a path carved with care, but walked by almost no one. It leads to a mechanism that may run for 10,000 years, or may fall silent within a human lifetime. It embodies a hope that ambition, properly disciplined by engineering and protected by stone, can escape the gravitational pull of the present. Whether that hope is justified will not be known until long after everyone who carved the staircase, designed the clock, or funded the mountain has become dust themselves.